Unlike other lines in Victoria, the idea of a spur line on the Victorian Railways network, besides the line to Flemington Racecourse, was basically non-existent. And I don't mean a regular spur line that had a very few stops between point A to point B, because the VR had many of those. I specifically mean a spur line that only served one town and for a few years was treated as a regular line. Well, for the case of the Wedderburn line, this was the case. In today's way long-awaited third episode of Victorian Lines, we will cover the Wedderburn line. I'm sorry that I was patient for an entire year. Before we can talk about the Wedderburn line itself, we need to talk about the line it branches off of. In 1882, the line from Eaglehawk to Corong Vale opened, which then eventually opened a whole can of worms for another day. One of the stops between the two towns was Wedderburn Junction. The purpose of the station, I couldn't tell you. Same for why they didn't just have the line go through Wedderburn. Anyways, I presume the reason behind the Wedderburn line was because of flour. The Wedderburn flour mill had opened 2 years prior in 1880 and was a fast-growing business and needed a quicker way to export their goods. Another was because the town was growing in population, and thus the VR could capitalize the flour industry of the line while also throwing a passenger service, later AEC rail motor service, into the mix. I'll get to that in a little bit. Thus, in 1887, the 7.6 kilometer line from Wedderburn Junction to Wedderburn was opened. I'm not sure if this photo was on opening day, but regardless, it was apparently taken in 1887. By the 1900s, traffic on the line was moderate. I presume that grey trains went down to Wedderburn for the flour mill, and in return, wagons full of flour would head up the line to be exported to different places around Victoria. However, in 1919, the flour mill burnt down to a crisp, with no records saying that the flour mill was rebuilt, thus ending all flour trains from Wedderburn and now only exporting general goods. In 1907, this is what Wedderburn station and yard would have looked like, with a 35 metre long platform, a locomotive shed, a goods shed and 3 sidings for goods, plus a small little siding thing just before the platform. Because no maps of the yard ever existed, here's my 1-minute mock-up of the yard with everything as mentioned. At some points in time, the middle siding was pulled up, the goods platform siding that switched back onto the main track at the end of the yard was removed, making it a standalone siding. The entire locomotive shed and siding were also pulled up. The extra straight at the far end of the yard might have been cut back with the yard being smaller in size, unless it was already the size regardless. And finally, the little siding just before the platform was also potentially cut down in size to be a derail siding of sorts. The flour mill burning down and most of Wedderburn's yard being removed wasn't all. In 1941, during World War II, the VR axed the AEC rail motor service to Wedderburn. I specifically assume it's an AEC rail motor, as apparently the children of the town would call the service the Wedderburn Bumblebee, despite its red and white colours and not being yellow and black. Goods traffic hauled by Y and T classes from the Robinvale and Colwyn lines to the later built silos at the yard was still happening, and on this draw map of Wedderburn Yard in the 1960s to the 1980s, there was some livestock platform thing. I'm not going to go too much into it, but I added it on the map regardless. The only real interesting bits and bobs is when special rail motor excursions would go down to Wedderburn, with one being a Derm excursion in 1974 and another being a 102 horsepower Walker rail car excursion in 1977. The ironic thing was that while on the return trip to Wedderburn Junction during the 1974 Derm excursion, the Derm, when it was making its way to the junction, had jumped the crossing and derailed, and in the process had chopped a bit of the rotten wooden sleepers. Interestingly, in 1976, the Wedderburn station platform was cut down from the original 35 metres to a puny 6 metres for some reason, despite the fact that the station wasn't even used. In 1981, according to Vixig, the train staff for the branch line to Wedderburn was also withdrawn and the line became part of the electric staff section. This meant, on a more basic term, was that if a train wanted to traverse down the Wedderburn line, they can get an electric staff from the signal boxes of Inglewood and Corongvale A. However, like all other lines from the mid-1960s to the late 1980s, The Wedderburn line could not escape closure, and on the 6th of December 1986, the Wedderburn line closed for services, with the line closing nearly a whole century after it opened, with the whole layout of Wedderburn Junction changing so that the points for the Wedderburn line was removed and changed out to a smooth single track curve to allow mainline speeds. I also assume this ginormous train was the last train to Wedderburn Junction, as the photo stated that some of these wagons were stored. Nothing was salvaged from the line post-closure minus some things, so I guess it wasn't nothing. Despite not being on the Wedderburn line itself, the junction, or Wedderburn Junction, which closed the same time the line itself closed, isn't entirely all gone. The Wedderburn Historical Engine and Machinery Society somehow managed to get a hold of the station and somehow trucked it all the way to its grounds in Wedderburn. Unfortunately, the same thing can be said for Wedderburn Station building itself, which was demolished during closure. There's also a sign at the location of Wedderburn Junction Station commemorating the line. Now, would services ever come back to Wedderburn? No. Unless you're this person on Facebook who thought that it would be a great idea to have a straight through line from Inglewood to Bourke, with Wedderburn being the middle stop on the line. This wouldn't even remotely work, not only for the obvious reason, but because Wedderburn is not even on the side of the Menangatang line it should be on for this to even work. This was episode 3 of the Victorian line series. I deeply apologise about this 1 year absence from this series and all Victorian content in general. I kind of just switched to doing other stuff, as Auntie Trains is going to be more of a generic channel, if it wasn't obvious. Also, a fun fact, if you actually read my post, you'll find out that the Port Fairy line was originally next in the lineup after Colwyn. But there's a much earlier thumbnail for the Robinvale line too. These two lines will eventually be covered, but stay tuned for episode 4. Goodbye, guys.